are these people?
First story is about the pilots, though, and I'm worried about the pilots. I think we all should be worried about the pilots. They're workers just like everybody else. They're blue collar. They may make slightly better salaries. They do impossible work, really hard, and we're going to learn about a little bit more about what they're up to right now. So this came out of Labor Notes, Jonah Furman, last week, and the pilots are speaking out on contract flights. I get to have a life too. Like, I'm reading through this. I'm like, nobody's talking about airline pilots. Wait, airline pilots too? Seriously? Like, is there anyone that's immune? Is there anyone that's not being squeezed? So I thought it was important to talk about some pilots and read this story really quickly. That's I just put the link for Rockfin in the chat. Rockfin's an ad-free platform. Go over there, sign up, subscribe for free. Shout out to INN that just hit its 2,000th follower for free on the platform. There is a premium subscription available that's going to be going up in price soon, but either way, all of our content's available basically for free. And you'll be able to see all the clips from this. By the end of the week, you'll see all of them free. I make a couple of them premium throughout the week, and as we release them, they become free there too. Anyway, pilots, holy moly, pilots. Airline labor is at a breaking point. Country's four largest airlines facing labor pilot conflict, all centering on mismanaged pandemic recovery. Yay! So the pilots are split among three unions, and they share grievances over grueling scheduling. This sounds very similar to the rail workers, right? And also to the Nabisco workers.
Yep.
So they say overworkers depleted their home lives while inflation eats into their paychecks. Well, of course, because they're not being raised to keep up with right now the rising cost of inflation. Here, Delta pilots voted by 99% to authorize a strike with 96% turnout. They all want it. They all want to fight. United pilots, 94% to reject a tentative agreement, and the American Pilots Union leadership voted not to even send their deal out for a vote. Southwest pilots filed for mediation in September, signaling the contract negotiations are not going to go smoothly either, right? So, any potential strikes are still a long way off. Airline unions are, interesting, covered under the Railway Labor Act, and negotiations are subject to extensive federal oversight before any legal strike or lockout can take place. I think we can thank the Reagan administration for that. I seem to recall in the early 80s, there was a pretty heavy airline pilot strike, and the government came in and broke that strike and forced the pilots to go back to work, if I remember correctly. But I'm not going to speak to the details. I need to research it. I'll be the first one to admit I don't know the details of that story. That's just what I remember as being a little kid.
Right.
So, like the rail negotiations, pilots' negotiations have stretched on for years without raises. But pilots and rail workers alike, the primary issue isn't money, it's time. And again, we've talked about this on the rail worker stuff. It's how much time they're getting. So again, not money, but time. So the airline industry has gone through incredible turbulence over the past 3 years. Not surprising. When the pandemic hit, demand collapsed, and obviously the flights went down 75% by May 2020. And what did they do? They furloughed or they laid off everybody. But air traffic rebounded just as fast, shooting up 80% from February to July of last year. All right, over the course of the pandemic, federal government spent more than $50 billion on stabilizing the industry. They pumped money into this thing. And that money was meant to maintain capacity for when the market bounced back. Makes sense, right? Instead, they did the opposite. They offered buyouts, encouraging thousands of pilots to take early retirement deals. And now that short-sighted decision has left them scrambling to keep up with demand. Yeah, they told all these pilots, take retirement packages so they could cut their books and show massive profits when demand was lower. And instead of using that to maintain the levels that they were already sustaining during pandemic or prior to pandemic, they instead reallocated that money and turned it into profit, which thanks federal government for that. And here's the result. More work for fewer pilots, more fatigue, and less time at home. We had on some days a tenfold increase on pilot fatigue calls. All right, this is not a canary in the coal mine. It's a lion roaring in a cage. I mean, you don't really hear that description too often from a pilot or like from a worker inside, but fatigue calls are based on a pilot's own judgment. Federal Aviation Administration regulations govern how long a pilot can be scheduled to work in a day, depending on such factors as start time, number of co-pilots. The pilots say what's legal under FAA rules and company policies is not necessarily what's safe or smart. That's haunting in itself, that pilots are not determining exactly what's safe or smart. That's, can we start right there now? And then he says, I have to make that call. Hey, you're legal. You can have a 13 or 14-hour day, but are you good to land in LaGuardia at midnight in a driving rainstorm? The more pressure that's put on you, it's pressure on the margin safety. I mean, so tours of duty, which are known as work blocks, and here this is also gets into, remember how they had that just-in-time scheduling for the rails, also getting longer.
Yeah.
So now, where pilots used to be assigned to leave home for 1 or 2 days at a time, now work blocks tend to be 4 or 5 days long. How do you sustain a marriage? How do you know your children at all with 4 or 5 days out? And here's the other problem, and I'm going to read that here. This also ups the stakes of calling in sick, because if you call out at the beginning of a work block, you're on the hook for 4 to 5 days of sick time, which is sometimes more than half a pilot's annual allowance. I mean, for missing one hop, because they decided to stretch the length of your hops. So in response,
Yep.
the unions are calling for more transparency and predictability in scheduling. Right? So typically, a pilot who's on reserve gets about 12 hours notice that they're on the short list to get called up. This is unbelievable. I could not believe I'm reading even this whole sentence. This is how they fuck these pilots in the first few months or first few years that they're putting in their time and paying their dues to gain their seniority. Right? So 12 hours notice that they're on a short list to get called up if they're on reserve. This isn't even if they're actually scheduled for a flight. It's going to give them time to commute to their... Right. They're on call. It gives them time to commute to their base airport, which is also often via a commuter plane, because they can't even afford to live near a base airport because they get paid so shitty. They don't say that, but that's the other rub. That's of course flight attendants as well as pilots, where they then wait in a hotel room for a few hours to get the call about when their tour will begin, if their tour will begin, because again, they're on call. If someone higher in the queue calls in sick or picks up a different shift, they could get called in sooner. And if there are delays, they could be held back longer. But in pre-pandemic times, this reserve system applied to mainly the lower seniority pilots who didn't yet have a fixed schedule, which is about 15 to 20% of the workforce, which, according to United Pilots, I mean, it's just a guesstimation. That's no official released statistic. But during 2020, 2021, 2022, even early, percentage of pilots on reserve near 50%. They had veterans got a taste of how broken and disruptive the reserve scheduling system has become. They had guys that had been, and women that had been pilots for 20, 30 years, sitting on reserve in a hotel room, waiting for a flight to either show up or to be assigned, or, I mean, this maybe. Okay, so again, the workforce reductions followed by rapid new hirings have also changed how the unions approach negotiations. Now they have about 6,000 pilots who weren't there last time they went through negotiations. So this was a 6-year Delta pilot. We've had generational shift, and the folks that are being hired now have a different idea and perspective. They expect the company will give us better benefits when it comes to work-life balance, right? Why does this even have to be said that we have a younger generation and they're like, I get to have a life. I'm not going to be my dad. Yeah. Yep. So.
Yep. I mean, my father, who works 30 days on, 30 days off, he definitely gets notice. You know, like, yeah, it's craziness.
There's a schedule.
Yeah,
You can
you're just
have
pull a week stint. Yeah,
consistency.
like, yeah, yep.
All right, so let's look at the chat. Hey, Rick Solis, welcome. So CS Moria, Air Traffic Controllers Union, Reagan fired them and then hired scabs. Okay. Yep. In case they don't hire scab, they can't. In this case, they can't just hire scab pilots. I don't think. I don't know how you hire scab air traffic controllers either, but I guess there are local ones. But you have to have a certain amount of time on certain planes, and most of them are ex-military because
And licensing and
it's
yeah,
so expensive
yep,
to get the hours in that kind of a
training.
jet to be able to even go
Yeah,
work for one of these airlines. I've done a little bit of homework about some of this stuff in the past.
yeah, me as
But
well.
again, I wanted to shout out the pilots. I got to fly earlier this month, and we had a smooth flight. And so these guys don't get nearly the love that they deserve, and they are well slightly higher paid than the average blue collar worker. They still are blue collar workers that are at the behest of management and that are working early on just for they're not making big money, and they're working shitty shifts to be able to pay their dues to be able to get there at some point. So shout out to all the pilots out there. Thank you, and we appreciate what you're doing, and we know that you're workers just like everybody else.